All righty, so here we go. So we've got a new country, we've got a government, a constitution, it's been ratified. We have to get a new president. The obvious choice is George Washington, who's a living legend at this time. He is rock star status in the United States, late 1700s. He's by far the wealthiest person in the country at that time. He's probably the wealthiest president we've ever had. So Washington it is. So let's meet George Washington here. Let's see what he's all about. So when Washington comes in, the nation's capital is in New York City, and George Washington looks at the Constitution, reads the Constitution. Most of the power goes to Congress. The president really has very little power. Most of the president's power involves foreign policy and things like that. In terms of spending money, Washington can't do it. The president can't do it, right? It's all with Congress. The main job Washington decides of the presidency is to be the face of the American government, to be the representative of the American government. When people around the world think of the United States and its government, they think of the president. So he's going to craft this image of what the presidency should be. And a lot of what he creates back in 1789 exists still today. George Washington thought that the president should be a man of the people. He should look like somebody you would see on the street, but maybe with a professional or some sort of powerful job. But he shouldn't dress and he shouldn't appear to be like royalty. He shouldn't wear clothing that is so ostentatious and so expensive that ordinary people around the country could never wear that, because then they wouldn't identify with the person. They would be seen as this king or ruler. So he believes you should dress nicely, but it shouldn't be clothes that are so out of the ordinary that if you saw them walking down the street, you would go, wow, boy, that's pretty expensive clothing. So he dresses very nicely. And still today, when you look at how the presidents dress, they do dress very businesslike. They wear the coat and tie, but it's not so out of the ordinary that if they were walking down the street, you wouldn't see somebody in a coat and tie and go, wow, boy, that person's really rich. He also wants the presidency to be to not seem, how would you say it, not seem overly royal or overly powerful. He's the one that pushes for the adoption of the term president. Alexander Hamilton, who we'll talk about here in a minute, Alexander Hamilton wanted his excellency. Washington thought that sounded too royal, too regal. So he's the one that pushes for the name the president. So he wants the presidency to appear to be professional, to appear to be powerful, but also be something that the common American can identify with. Okay? He wants to provide moral leadership for the nation. He wants to be the moral leader of this nation. He believes that's an important job of the president, that the president should act and lead the country. He would want the way he would want the country to act and react to situations. He also realizes that there's a lot of things that the president is responsible for, that the president has to create and take care of, like the budget and the leader of the military. And he realizes this is a lot for the president, for one person to do, and some of the stuff requires the president to be involved in issues and matters that maybe he's not all that well versed or not very strong in. So he's going to need some help to create these or some help to complete these duties that are assigned to him. So he's going to bring in some helpers. He creates the cabinet. The cabinet is not outlined in the Constitution, but George Washington theorizes, since it doesn't say I can't have advisors and people helping me craft policy, then there's no reason why I can't do it. The Constitution doesn't say I can't. have these people, so it must mean I can. So he brings in these advisors to help him craft and direct policy of the United States and help him perform his job. And he calls this the cabinet. The cabinet are his advisors. So let's meet his cabinet. Of course, there's John Adams, vice president, who at one time thought he could beat George Washington and very quickly realized he could not. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, probably the most educated person maybe in the Western world. He's incredibly smart and he's very, very diplomatic, and he already has lots of relations over in Europe, namely in France. So, Secretary of State is going to be Thomas Jefferson, man who helped write the Declaration of Independence. Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a bookseller actually in New York City who learned military strategy because British soldiers, for whatever reason, frequented his bookstore, and he would listen to them and he would talk to them about military strategy. And he learned from them how to conduct war and how to command troops. And during the American Revolution becomes an invaluable resource to George Washington in directing and leading troops into combat. So he's going to be the Secretary of War, Henry Knox. And then perhaps until recently, the most forgotten founding father, but in my opinion, and it's always been my opinion, the most important founding father, Alexander Hamilton. He is wickedly brilliant, unbelievably brilliant. Alexander Hamilton is an orphan. He comes to the United States at that time, the colonies. He's 13, 14 years old from the Caribbean. He stows away on a ship to get here. He ends up in New York City. A guy who owns a shipping company kind of takes Alexander Hamilton under his wing and begins to teach him about shipping and about economics. And Alexander Hamilton becomes fascinated with economics and economic theory. We don't know much about his parents. His mother was a prostitute. His father probably was a pirate. Arr, a pirate. Arr. And his mother dies very, very young. When he's very, very young, he's taken in by his cousin. His cousin commits suicide, and then at that point, he stows away and comes to the United States or to the colonies. And he is a brilliant writer and a brilliant thinker. However, he really likes England. He likes a lot of what England does. He just doesn't want to be a part of England. He wants the United States to become a mini England. And he and Thomas Jefferson really don't get along with each other. They have a respect for each other, but they don't like each other's politics, and they really don't like each other personally. And a lot of people didn't like Alexander Hamilton. He was very difficult to deal with. He was extraordinarily arrogant. He had lots of problems in his personal life. He especially liked other people's wives. He married his wife because he was in love with his wife's sister, and his wife's sister was unavailable at that time. She was married, and so he married his wife so he could be closer to his wife's sister. Very bizarre. So that's Alexander Hamilton, and that's it. That's all of his cabinet. We have Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury. All of these men have the ability, including George Washington, to step forward and really take the government by the reins and start moving it and directing it in ways that they want to. George Washington doesn't do this. George Washington is very cautious and very careful about appearing to be a dictator or a king. John Adams probably would have liked to have done that, but at this point, John Adams knows his place. Thomas Jefferson is very worried, as Washington was, of appearing to be a dictator and a king, and he definitely did not want that. That was something that was definitely against Thomas Jefferson's belief. Thomas Jefferson tends to believe in a very small, inactive federal government. Henry Knox was fearful of becoming a military dictator. He didn't want the military to run this country, so he's not going to do it. So that leaves Alexander Hamilton, who is more than happy to move forward and begin driving this country forward. Alexander Hamilton has a vision of what this country can be, should be, will be, someday can be. He believes that this country can be an enormous economic giant as he looks westward. And who knows what's out west? But this is a gigantic country, and we've already, in this small sliver of where the United States currently is along the Atlantic seaboard, there's already a wealth and a bountiful amount of economic uh, treasures. Who knows what we'll find when we move west? And Alexander Hamilton believes economics runs everything. Everything comes back to economics. And if you have a strong economical base, this country is unstoppable. And if Jefferson or Adams or Knox or Washington are not willing to step forward, Alexander Hamilton is. So he only believes that rich and educated people should lead. He believes in he kind of believes in an American aristocracy. He believes that rich people are the ones who become educated, and the reason that they're rich and the reason they become educated is because they are somehow genetically better than poor people, and therefore they're the ones who should lead. He's extraordinarily worried about giving the vote to everybody. At this time, only white men who owned property could vote. If you owned property back then, that was a measurement of wealth. That was how they measured your wealth. How much land did you have? He believes only wealthy people should vote. He's very worried if poor people get the right to vote, which would be anybody in his view. If everybody got the right to vote, poor people got the right to vote, who knows what would happen? He believes it'd make very, very poor choices. So he's very interested in the rich and the elite leading this government. He reasons that the rich have the most to lose. So they're going to do what's in the best interest of the country. Poor people have nothing to lose, so they'll do crazy things, he believes. So only the rich should govern because they have the most to lose. So they're going to make the best choices possible to protect their wealth. Again, common people are not smart enough to lead. And they didn't have enough. They didn't have things to lose, so they were going to do crazy things. Okay. So he wants to get rich and well-educated people involved in the government, to believe in this government. And his financial program, this is one of the geniuses of his financial program, is going to be designed to appeal to the rich people to get them involved. So Hamilton's going to issue a series of financial reports and recommendations about how to make this country an economic powerhouse in the future, and to make this country what it can be, should be, will be someday, an economic powerhouse. So his first report that he gives to Congress is in January of 1790. It's called Report on Public Credit. So here's the issue at this time. The federal government owes $40 million to its citizens. And this is money that the government borrowed from its citizens to fight the American Revolution because the federal government had no money. So they were borrowing from their citizens. And currently, the federal government owes $40 million. Okay. Federal government also owes $10 million to foreign countries that we borrowed from to fight the Revolutionary War. Most of this money is owed to France. So now we owe a total of $50 million. The federal government now owes $50 million, which in 1790 was an unbelievable amount of money. It was unconscionable. It was unthinkable how much money that was. Then individual states, because remember, individual states are acting as their own country. So individual states, to a large degree, were responsible for fighting the Revolutionary War within their states. And individual states had borrowed money from its citizens. And individual states owed a total of $25 million to their state. So if you took all of the debts that all of the states, Connecticut and New York and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia, took the total sum of all those debts and combined them together that the states owed to their citizens, it's $25 million. Hokey smoky, that's a lot of money. So a lot of people have said, look, we've got a new government. This is kind of a fresh start. This is an unbelievable amount of money. $85 million total owed for the American Revolution is money that will never be repaid. It will take forever to repay this. We should just wipe those debts away, say we're sorry, and move on and begin fresh and new. Hamilton says, oh, nay, nay, we're not going to do that. We are not at all going to do that. Here's what Hamilton says we should do. Hamilton says, we've got $10 million. We can cobble together enough money to right now and pay off that $10 million to foreign countries. Right now, we can pay that off. Let's do that immediately. Okay. He said, by doing this, it makes the United States look good in the eyes of the world. Okay. It gives us political and economic capital. Okay. If we pay off our foreign debts, other countries will then look at the United States and go, the United States is pretty trustworthy, right? We can rely on them to pay back that money. So if we have to go to them again for political help or economic help, they'll be willing to do that because we've built up our credit, so to speak, with them. Also, Hamilton reasons, if we pay off $10 million, most of which to France, it really doesn't give foreign countries a reason to come and invade the country and essentially repossess us for failure to pay back debt. So Hamilton says, let's pay it off right now. We don't have to worry about being invaded by foreign countries in an attempt to repay their debt. And it gives us political and economic credit. Then he says the federal government should take on that $25 million debts that the states owe, right? So the federal government should just tell the states, you are not responsible for paying back this $25 million. The federal government is. Oh! So we get rid of $10 million in foreign debt. We take on $25 million of debt. Now the federal government debt is $65 million. What is Hamilton thinking? People cannot believe 65 million. We were going crazy with $40 million in federal debt. You want to increase it to 65? Are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? Hamilton says, oh, I am crazy. Crazy like a fox. He said, because what's going to happen is all of this money is owed to rich, powerful men in the country. These are men who are smart. These are men who are rich. And if they want to get paid back, they're going to get involved in this government. And they are going to support this government. And they're going to do everything they can to make sure this government succeeds, because the success of this government means that they get repaid. And their desire to get repaid depends on the success of the government. So Hamilton says, let's take on $65 million worth of debt and tell these rich, smart, powerful men in this new American aristocracy that if you want your money, you need to support us and you need to be involved. And that's how you get repaid. And that argument is compelling enough that Congress agrees. His next report in crafting this American economy is a report on the National Bank. And he gives this report in February of 1790. So here's what Hamilton says. Hamilton says the United States should create a national bank. And the purpose of this bank is to print money. That only the federal government can print money, because currently there's all these states have their own money, and in many cases, state money, this individual state money, was more desirable, and people wanted it instead of federal money, which was pretty much worthless because the federal government couldn't tax. Now the federal government has the ability to tax. The Constitution gives the federal government the ability to lay and collect taxes. So now the money should only come from one source, right? Paper money and metal money, coins, should only come from one source, and that's from the federal government. And it would be up to the national bank to determine how much money to make in any given year, and then to distribute that money out to the public so it can be used. This federal bank will also set interest rates on loans so that people can take out loans and the interest rate won't fluctuate wildly from state to state or region to region. The federal government would establish those interest rates, which will help stabilize the economy. And since we're taking in money, since the federal government now has the ability to tax and collect money, we've got to be able to put that money somewhere and then have the ability to pay the bills that we got to pay. We're going to pay $10 million to France to pay off our foreign debt. How is that going to be done? Who's going to write these checks? Where is that money going to come from? Let's create a national bank and to do all of these things, to distribute money, to determine how much money to print, to set interest rates for the country, and to pay bills, and also be a depository for tax collections. Jefferson, in particular, and James Madison, who was the principal architect of the Constitution, hate this idea of the national bank. Hate it with a passion. They cannot believe that Washington or that Hamilton would want this. They strongly oppose this. They believe that it gives the federal government too much power over the economy. They don't think the federal government should have that type of control and power over the economy. It was very British, they said, because essentially England has the exact same setup. England has their own national bank. So it's too much power for the federal government. It's very British, and they said it's unconstitutional. The government can't do this. They say it's unconstitutional. It gives the government far too much power. Hamilton's response is this: of course it's very British. Of course England has a national bank. Of course I took this idea from England. And you know why? Do you know why England has a national bank? Do you know why I took that idea from them? Because it works. England has the most powerful, strongest, greatest economy that the world had ever known to that point. Do you think it was by accident? They understand what needs to be done. If they have a national bank and it is one of the foundations of their strong economy, then why would we not do the same thing if we want just a strong economy? It works, and that's why England has it. Then Hamilton points out the Constitution says very clearly only the federal government can coin money. The government has the power to collect taxes. If we have the ability to collect taxes, that means that tax money has to go somewhere. If the government is the only one in the country who now has the ability to print money, to coin money, then how is that going to be taken out? How is that going to be carried out? So Hamilton says it may not say explicitly in the Constitution that we can do this, but it doesn't say that we can't do it. He said it's an implied power. It's implied because we have the ability to collect taxes. It's implied because we have the ability to, we are the only ones who have the ability to print and distribute money. It's implied. Somehow that has to be done. How else are we going to do this? And then Hamilton points to a clause in the Constitution called the Elastic Clause. And essentially, here's what the Elastic Clause says. There's so many things that the federal government is responsible for. There's so many things that the federal government has to do that it's impossible to list every single thing that we do that the federal government has to do in this Constitution. Otherwise, we'll have a 5,000-page document. And how, in 1787, are they going to know what the federal government is going to have to do in 2020? They don't know. So they put in this elastic clause that says the federal government, not all the powers of the federal government are listed here, but the federal government has the ability to do what it needs to do to essentially meet its requirements. That's the elastic clause. So Hamilton says it doesn't say that we can have a federal bank, but it doesn't say that we don't. We can't have a federal bank. And it seems to be implied because there's all these other things that the federal bank has to do. Now, you're about to become smarter than 95% of Americans. You ready? So here's what happens. Jefferson is still very much against this, and Jefferson is a very, very powerful voice in the country at this time. So Jefferson and Hamilton make a deal to get Jefferson to support the national bank. Jefferson begrudgingly maybe acknowledges that the national bank is necessary and needed, but he's still not willing to come out publicly and say that. So he and Hamilton have a meeting, and they strike a deal. Currently, the federal government is looking for a permanent home. They've been in New York City, they were in Philadelphia. They're looking for somewhere to be permanent, where that will be the capital city of the United States. It seems like it's leaning towards New York City becoming somewhere around New York City, becoming the capital city of the federal government. Southerners are not having it. People in the South absolutely, positively, completely, totally do not want the capital to be in the North, because the North seems to get everything. And the North really doesn't like slavery. And they're very worried about that. So the South is adamant that the capital city cannot be in the North. So Hamilton, who is a very powerful voice in the federal government, and those who support the Constitution, and he's a Federalist. Hamilton proposes a deal. If Jefferson can get his group to support the federal bank, the national bank, Hamilton will recommend that the federal capital be put in the South, and that land be taken from Maryland and Virginia, which were both at that time considered to be in the South. That land will be taken from Maryland and Virginia to create a national city. Jefferson agrees. Hamilton agrees. And that's how the national bank is created. And that's how Washington, D.C. is created, out of a political deal made between Hamilton and Jefferson. There's one stipulation that's going to become very important in the future. It's like super duper important. Like, this is going to be the political issue of its day. The charter of the national bank, meaning that the national bank has to be renewed essentially every 20 years. Every 20 years, they're going to revisit to see if the national bank is still needed, and if its charter should be renewed, meaning that the national bank can exist for another 20 years. Or should the charter be taken away and the national bank abolished? File that in the back of your brain, because that's going to become immensely important in the coming weeks. And then on March 1790, the most controversial part of Hamilton's plan, the whiskey tax. One of the largest industries in the United States in the late 1700s was whiskey distilling, particularly in western Pennsylvania, where there was lots and lots and lots of whiskey distilling. It was an important part of their economy. Whiskey is a drink of the poor. It was a fairly cheap drink. It was a fairly accessible drink. So it's mostly poor who drank it. Rich people like Hamilton did not drink whiskey. Oh, nay, nay. They drank wine. Whiskey is for the poor. Important distinction. Most of the production of the corn and other ingredients that are needed for whiskey are done by poor rural farmers, particularly in western Pennsylvania, like I said. So whiskey is and for the poor. It is a poor person's drink. Hamilton, looking for a way to increase tax revenue so we can begin paying our bills and begin putting money into the federal bank, proposes a very steep tax on whiskey, a really steep tax on whiskey. This angers the poor, especially farmers in Western Pennsylvania, who get angry about the federal government taxing something that they really like and increasing the cost of whiskey. So in 1794, a bunch of poor farmers in Western Pennsylvania began marching towards Philadelphia, which is where the federal government was at that time, to overthrow the government and protest taxation without representation. That this is, again, the federal government, just like England, coming down and taxing unfairly the poor people. And they begin marching towards Philadelphia to stage this rebellion and overthrow the government because of this whiskey tax. Oof, this is going to be the first big test for this new nation. Remember, with Shays' Rebellion, we didn't have an army. And essentially, rich people had to hire their own army to protect the Massachusetts government from Shays' Rebellion. And that's what convinced the country we needed a new government. This is going to be the first big test. Washington finds out, and he sends out Henry Knox and this new national military that's fairly small at that point. And they go out and they meet these farmers in Western Pennsylvania, and they quickly defeat the rebellion. It's the first big test of this new nation, and it passes. And Washington is able to get Hamilton to agree to keep the whiskey tax, but lower it. And he agrees. All right, so big division is happening between Hamilton and Tommy J. Okay, Tommy J and Hamilton, they respect each other, but they don't like each other, politically or personally. On the opposite side of the political spectrum on virtually everything. Anything that you bring up politically, you can be guaranteed that they will not agree with each other. They also don't like each other personally. Hamilton is part of this new aristocracy, and Hamilton likes being with rich people, and Hamilton really likes the finer things in life. Thomas Jefferson, although he's rich, identifies more with rural and poor people. Alexander Hamilton loves big cities. He loves the excitement and the eliteness of the big cities and the wealthy. And they fight with each other all the time during cabinet meetings. All the time they fight with each other. Washington usually tried to keep in the middle, but more often than not, he agreed with Hamilton. And so eventually, at the end of Washington's first term, Jefferson has had enough of Hamilton's eliteness and snobbery, and Washington seemingly always agreeing with Hamilton. And so Jefferson resigns as Secretary of State at the end of Washington's first term. So that's Washington's domestic policy. It was pretty much shaped by Hamilton. Now let's talk about his foreign policy. And we're going to begin with the French. Surprise! In the middle of the French Revolution, which is raging out of control at this time over in France, and they're chopping off people's heads left and right, and it's just chaos and anarchy reigning, England looks over and goes, yeah, looks like a good time to go put it to the French. And England declares war on France in the middle of all this. Maybe in small part to get back at the French for their help in the American Revolution. So France is in the middle of this very chaotic, very bloody revolution. And now England declares war on them. In 1793, a French diplomat, a man by the name of Edmond Genet, he shows up for the United States help. And he knocks on Washington's door. Washington opened up the door. Yes. And there's Edmond Genet. And he's holding in his hand the Treaty of Alliance that stated that France would help the United States in its war against England for independence. And the United States would agree to always be an ally and support for France when it needed help. So Edmund Genet said, oh, I am here to get the Americans to help me in our war against the English. We help you defeat the English. Now you come defeat us. Defeat the English with us. No. England or Washington goes, no, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm sorry. I really appreciate the help you gave us in the American Revolution. But right now, I'm not going to send American troops over to France to fight the English. He said, look, we don't have enough money as it is to kind of run our government. How are we going to send an army or aid over to France? And we really don't have an army. We just had a bunch of angry poor farmers we had to go fight. You think we can send them over to France to help you? And we don't want to give England a reason to show back up. If we help them fight you, England has another reason to come visit us. We were lucky. We were really lucky. It was only with God's help that we defeat them the first time. I don't know that we can do it again, and I don't want to try it again. So, sorry, but not sorry. France is England. Oh, stupid American! We knew we could not agree on the Americans. And Edmund Genet stomps out. He's very, very bitter. Then somebody else shows up. 1794. There's a knock at the door. Washington opens it up, and there's England. And Washington goes, oh, well, this is a real surprise. And England goes, oh, chip, chip, cheerio. So we understand that the French were here the other day, and they asked you for some help. And Washington says, yeah, they were, but I told them, I couldn't afford politically, militarily, or economically, I can't afford to help the French. So I sent them on their way. Oh, jolly good, jolly good. So we'd like to propose a treaty between us and you to keep you out of the war that's currently going on in Europe. Washington says, what? Yes. So we want to make sure that you, as America, do not show up in Europe to fight in the middle of this war. After all, this war is not really yours. And Washington says, I just told you that. And England goes, I know, but it'd be so much better if we put it down in writing. So Washington goes in the back room and he pulls out an advisor, a guy by the name of John Jay. And he says, look, England wants to get a treaty with us where we promise not to get involved in the war in Europe. And John Jay says, well, I didn't think we were. And Washington says, we're not. That's what I just told him, but they want a treaty anyway, so go see what you can do. So John Jay goes off and he talks with England, and they create a treaty. And here's what they get. The United States is going to get England to agree to recognize us always and forever as an independent country. England still kind of sees the United States as, well, we're just taking a break from each other, but eventually we're going to be back together. He wants England to say, nope, they are an independent country. We're never getting back together. We're seeing other people, and we're much happier. The United States also wants the English to stop arming Indians on the frontier. England has all of these forts all along the frontier, and they keep sending soldiers out to attack Americans, and it's not nice. Stop that. We want to reestablish trade with England, right? England is the crown jewel in trade. We want to trade with them. I almost got ahead of myself. England agrees to all of this. They're going to stop arming Indians on the frontier. They're going to start trading in the United States, and they're going to formally, forever, publicly recognize the United States is not part of England. All in exchange for the United States agreeing to stay out of the war in Europe, which we've already said we were. Now, the Pinckney Treaty. 1795, there's a knock at the door. Washington opened up the door. There's Spain. Spain is very worried about the Jay Treaty and that it has created this alliance between the United States and England, and the United States is going to get involved in this war on the side of England. And Spain doesn't want that because they don't like the English. And Washington says, no, I'm not going to Europe. We're not going to Europe at all. I told the French that. I told the English that. And now I'm telling you this, Spain. Well, Spain says, yeah, I know. I can't do a Spanish accent. Spain says, yeah, I know. So, but we'd still like a treaty where you formally say that you're going to stay out of Europe. So Washington goes in the back room, gets another advisor, Thomas Pinckney. He tells Thomas Pinckney, look, Spain wants a treaty with us, saying that we agreed to stay out of the war in Europe between England and France. And Thomas Pinckney says, well, I thought we've already told France and England that. And Washington said, I know, I told him that. But Spain still wants a treaty. So they negotiate a treaty. And here's what the treaty says. In exchange for the United States promising not to get involved in European wars like we've already promised everybody else, the United States is going to get the following from Spain. Spain is going to allow U.S. ships up and down the Mississippi access to the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans. At that time, Spain controlled the Louisiana Territory, and they were not allowing the United States access to the Gulf of Mexico on and off the Mississippi. It was a huge burden for trade for the United States at that time. Spain is now going to allow that. Spain, which has had a very nasty habit in the southeastern part of the United States of arming Native Americans and encouraging them to attack American settlers along the Spanish border. Not nice. So the United States wants Spain to agree to stop arming Native Americans and encouraging them to attack Americans. Spain agrees as long as we agree to stay out of Europe. And that's the treaty. So in Washington serves 2 terms. And they're fairly successful. He's kept us out of what would have been devastating wars in Europe. He's established treaties with all of the major European powers, except for France, which is having its problems. He set the course with Hamilton's help for creating this economic powerhouse, and he's had a fairly peaceful domestic term. So in 1796, the federal government asked Washington, God, you're going to run again, right? 3rd term as president. You're going to do this again. You were so successful and people love you. Washington refuses. He says he's not going to run for a 3rd term. Washington says that 2 terms as president is more than enough for any president of the United States. That he believes that if a president serves more than 2 terms, that the presidency and the executive branch will slowly begin to accumulate power. And it would be very easy for the president to then become a dictatorship. And he's very weary about that. He said, we fought against that. I'm not going to have any part in creating a new one, an American monarchy or dictatorship. So he says 2 terms is enough. And he sets the precedent. That's where we get the precedents today of 2 terms as president. It goes back to Washington, who believed any more would lead to too much power being accumulated by the president or the executive branch. Besides, he's really tired. He helped win a war against England. He helped craft this nation, and he served his country as its president. He feels he's done enough, and he just wants to go home. Before he leaves, Washington gives his farewell address, and he warns the country to avoid 2 things that could destroy the nation if these 2 things happen. This is in his farewell address. Don't do these things for a successful to guarantee the future success of the United States. Avoid foreign entanglement. Don't become involved in other countries' problems. That just leads to your own problems, and you get embroiled in their problems. Don't do that. 2, do not develop what he called political factions or parties. He said if you create political parties, if you allow political parties to begin and to begin to take power in the country, he said what will begin to happen is that individuals in those parties will be much more concerned and worried and interested in their own political successes and their party's political successes and wins, or maybe more interested in the losses, in the defeats of the other political party, than they will in the success and the well being of the country. They will become more interested in themselves and their political beliefs than they will in the country and its well being. Don't do that, he said. With these parting words, Washington leaves the presidency and goes to his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, where Washington every day has a parade of people coming through his house wanting to see him and hold an audience with him. And Washington lives on Mount Vernon, leaving very rarely from Mount Vernon until his death in December of 1799. We are done with notes for today. Have a good one, Panther.